Welcome, Andy, and over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Andalib, but you are all very welcome to also call me Andy if you like. I have worked as a criminal litigator and worked in the charity sector in Pakistan before starting at Reprieve, which I started last September. Throughout my career, I have been working on the death penalty, either directly or indirectly. I will be speaking to you today about the death penalty in South Asia with a focus on Pakistan. Now, founded in 1999, Reprieve has spent the last 20 years fearlessly pursuing justice for those the world condemns, ignores, or considers expendable, speaking truth to power, and exposing some of the worst injustices of the 21st century. We work for the most disenfranchised people in society, as it is in their cases that human rights are most swiftly abandoned and the rule of law is cast aside. Therefore, we promote and protect the rights of those facing the death penalty and those who are victims of extreme human rights abuses committed in the context of the so-called war on terror, with a focus on secret prisons, and state-sanctioned assassinations. To achieve these aims, we carry out in-country investigations into the use of the death penalty and the implementation of counterterrorism policy. We then litigate cases on strategic significance in order to seek some measure of justice for our clients and create a public record of abuses committed. We also elevate our client stories in public consciousness through a tailored communications program, which functions to raise and shift the debate on the issues. Now, Reprieve was founded by Clive Stafford Smith on the back of his 25 years of experience defending individuals on US death rows. Our secret prisons and assassinations grew out of our work to prevent the execution of individuals being detained without charge or trial in Guantanamo Bay. Reprieve is made up of a small bunch of human rights defenders. Our staff body is made up of lawyers, investigators, storytellers, and campaigners. We have learned that the best way to address human rights abuses is by supporting and working closely with human rights defenders on the ground. This means people who know the law, customs, and language of the country in which we are sort of working. This also means that we are training up people who are likely to stay in the country and continue the work. They are very much fighting a difficult battle and they work very hard at what they do. By providing them with expertise and skills and influence, we will develop a new generation of skilled human rights defenders invested in their country's future. Our experience can prevent them from reinventing the wheel, and we also offer them support, which helps them build their offices and maintain their drive. Our fellows and partner organizations are renowned for their work. They are why we have the testimony that underpins our litigation. Typically, our fellows will identify victims of human trafficking, of human abuses, of human rights abuses, and we will then bring those people and their stories to decision makers. Fellows and staff at partner organizations carry out in-country work. For example, one of our Pakistan fellows led the successful legal petition to have drones declared illegal by the Peshawar High Court. We are strategic in the way we work, taking on cases we believe will shift the narrative on the issues we are seeking to address. Our approach works, and over the past 20 years, we have saved the lives of hundreds of people seeking justice for those the world condemns, ignores, and considers indispensable. Reprieve has directly saved over 500 people from death rows from across the world, from the US to Pakistan, from Indonesia to Saudi Arabia. This is in addition to the thousands of lives that we have saved indirectly through our strategic projects, which shape the abolition landscape. This includes, for example, our work on the Stop Lethal Injection project. Reprieve has also secured the release of 80 men from Guantanamo Bay, which is more than any other law firm or NGO, and continues to work on cases of 7 men that remain in Guantanamo Bay. Our work to highlight human rights costs of drone strikes has seen us amplify the voices of over 100 individuals affected by drone strikes in Pakistan and Yemen, telling the short and long-term costs of strikes on the affected communities. Now, our work specifically in the South Asia region focuses on death row prisoners in Pakistan, including British nationals accused of death-eligible offenses. We also do thematic investigation and advocacy, such as reporting on Pakistan's anti-terror laws. We work with local legislators and policymakers to reduce the number of death-eligible offenses. Our advocacy work also includes working with policymakers in the UK, EU, and the UN, who are sort of influential and sort of raise the issue of the death penalty in that region. Reprieve works very closely with local partners, including Foundation for Fundamental Rights, FFR for short, and sort of other lawyers, and providing litigation and investigation support, research, and of course funding. We monitor the situation closely there, and we identify opportunities for strategic casework and media campaigns which are aimed at abolishing the death penalty in the region. Now, what you see before you are sort of figures to sort of illustrate the use and application of the death penalty in the region. Now, the figures that are mentioned here are mostly from Amnesty International's annual report on death sentences and executions for the year 2019. I should highlight that Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq account for 81% of the confirmed global executions in 2019. So the execution, so basically 19% is 4 other countries. Specifically, if you look at the figures for the South Asia region, you can see that Pakistan has the most executions and also has the largest death row population in the region. I should also mention that Pakistan has the second largest reported death row in the world. I forgot to mention that on the global figures, this does not include sort of China, Vietnam, and sort of other countries whose information is not public. China is considered as having sort of being one of the largest executioners in the world. Sorry, coming back to South Asia. As you can see that Pakistan is the highest executioner. However, before 2014, Pakistan had a moratorium on the death penalty, and it was only after sort of the very, very tragic attack on a school in Peshawar that the moratorium was lifted, and then continued to be, and then started executing people at a very high rate, leading Pakistan to be one of the top executioners in the world at the time. As the moratorium was lifted in December 2014, only 7 people were executed in 2014. However, 325 people were executed in 2015, 88 in 2016, 66 in 2017, 15 in 2018, and 14 in 2019. As you can see from the figures, Pakistan also has a very large death row population, and so do all of the other countries. And this is something that that I will highlight later on as well. Now, when we think about sort of the death penalty, we need to really consider sort of what crimes are in fact punishable by death. Now, the international law on this is specifically for the most serious crimes. This is dictated by Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the short form is the ICCPR. I should mention that all the South Asian countries that I've mentioned have ratified the ICCPR. The meaning of most serious crimes is only crimes of extreme gravity involving intentional killing. Now, even though all of these countries have in fact ratified it, not all of them follow it. To sort of show you how and why, I have used the examples of India and Pakistan. Now, as we saw previously, India does not execute that many people and has a relatively smaller death row population. However, India does have 58 offenses that are eligible with the death penalty. However, in contrast, it is only imposed for murder simplister, murder involving sexual violence, and rape. One of the reasons why India's application of the death penalty is much more restricted is because it uses the rarest of the rare principle when applying the death penalty. In the Bachchan Singh case, it was held that the provision of death penalty was an alternative punishment insofar that it is neither unreasonable nor is it against public interest. Hence, it should sort of be considered as an exception, not a rule. Pakistan, on the other hand, has 33 offenses that carry the death penalty. However, it is imposed by and large mostly in narcotics, blasphemy, rape, murder, and terrorism. Now, previously, when I discussed sort of the executions post 2014, all of the executions have been for murder and terrorism. Nobody has in fact been executed for narcotics or blasphemy. One of the interesting facts about blasphemy is the fact that it is the only crime with a mandatory death sentence. Narcotics is something that I will sort of be discussing later on. Now, when we think about sort of why Pakistan has so many people on death row, a very generic answer to that would be that the criminal justice and legal system are flawed. And sort of in order to determine that, so in order to sort of analyze this in a better way and to have sort of more statistics attached to it, this can be seen in sort of the 2-year long study that we did, which analyzes the Supreme Court's jurisprudence, sort of the Supreme Court of Pakistan's laws, sort of judgments on that it gave on death penalty cases. There were 310 cases that we analyzed. They were between the years 2010 to 2018. Of these, 78% of the cases were overturned. That means that the death sentence, which was given, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, was then not given to them, as in they were either acquitted or their sentences were converted to another sentence like life. Now, one of the things about cases by the Supreme Court is that they need to be followed by courts lower to them, which is the High Court and the Trial Court. And the sort of the case law developed by the Supreme Court has, we have found that it has not been properly implemented by the lower courts, nor is it effectively used by sort of lawyers at the trial court level. Of the 78 of the people whose sentences were converted, 39% were for acquittal. Now, what's interesting about these findings is that this actually does give an image as to why so many people are in fact on death row. I should mention the fact that we found that a person has spent 10 years in prison by the time their case reaches the Supreme Court. So 70% of the acquittals were based, or 70% of the acquittals were acquitted because they were based on unreliable witness testimonies. So that means that they were chance witnesses or they contradicted the physical evidence. Chance witnesses generally means that a witness whose presence at the scene of the offense was not natural. They shouldn't have there was no logical reason for them to be there. 74% of the acquittals it was found that the trial court was sentenced them without sufficient proof of guilt. 65% in 65% of the acquittals, there were serious doubts on the reliability of the police's investigation. And in 40% of the acquittals and 61% of commutations are generally where the sentence has been changed. The prosecution has failed to prove the motive, intent, or the guilty mind of the accused. All of the judgments, every judgment which dealt with a non-lethal offense, basically in an offense where somebody did not die, the Supreme Court overturned the conviction. Now, what I've previously discussed is sort of more systemic problems with sort of the criminal justice system and with investigation. I will now sort of be dealing more specifically with more specific problems that continue to persist in the Pakistani justice system, which then affects individuals on death row. The first is juveniles. Now, one of the things is that Pakistan does have a law that specifically prohibits anyone under the age of 18 from being sentenced to death. This is as per the Juvenile Justice System Ordinance of 2000, which was then repealed by the Juvenile Justice System Act of 2018. Now, this is to conform with Pakistan's international obligations under the Convention on the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the ICCPR. However, one of the problems we found is that this is routinely not applied. And to that effect, we have a case in which a family of 6 were arrested in 2016. It included 2 adults and 3 juveniles who were charged with drug offenses. Now, due to the police negligence and mishaps by the courts, the children were not recognized as juveniles. Reprieve and FFR, we had to then sort of take this case up with the FCDO and the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office and the British High Commission, and then also we assisted the local lawyers to then highlight the fact that they were in fact children and could not be sentenced to death and hence should be given bail. We also had to file a complaint with the UN Special Rapporteur on Executions, Dr. Agnes Calamar, to sort of further amplify their situation. Even though this case, they were in fact recognized as juveniles, there are several reports of individuals who were juveniles at the time of the offense and were not given the benefits under the law. Now, mentally ill, this is another group of individuals who definitely should be given the benefit. And this is something that has been recognized by international law as well, is that people who with severe mental health problems should not be given the death penalty. There is no legislation debarring those with mental health problems from receiving the death penalty or from being executed. However, under the criminal law in Pakistan, serious mental health problems are recognized as an exception, and especially when at the time of the offense. And then there is also a special procedure for the trial of those with mental health problems when they're sort of considered incapable of making their defense. Now, interestingly, when it comes to sort of mentally ill on death row, is that last month, the Supreme Court of Pakistan, in a landmark ruling, decided and came up with a judgment that said that those with severe mental health problems cannot be executed. The judgment also laid down specific steps that need to be taken to determine this. Now, we worked on a case of a Pakistani veteran who was sentenced to death by the anti-terror courts, which incidentally were also being funded by the UK at the time. And also his case was before the Supreme Court's case came out. And it was through sort of with private advocacy with sort of British policymakers and the European Commission officials. And we worked with the local partner on this, which then prevented the person from being executed as his execution warrant had been issued. This was sort of through a letter of support from UK MPs, medical professionals, and a member of Veterans Defence Advocacy, which then aided in stopping his execution warrant. Another horrible reality of criminal investigation in Pakistan is the rampant use of torture by law enforcement officials. One of the key problems, of course, with this is the fact that it leads to forced confessions and flawed investigations, which then in turn leads to a trial that sentences the person to death. Now, there is no law currently in Pakistan that criminalizes torture by law enforcement officials. And however, this is also against Pakistan's commitments under the United Nations Convention Against Torture. And one of the reasons why this is such a problem as well is that when a victim of torture needs to bring a complaint against the police or prove that they have been tortured, they will need to pursue the normal route of sort of using the actual bodily harm or grievous bodily harm provisions, so sort of provisions about how badly you've been hurt under sort of the normal system, which is of course then investigated by the police, which then leads to them having a very long sort of very private litigation against sort of the police and everything. And it's just this never ending battle, which just results in sort of victims not getting the justice that they need. Another aspect of the death penalty that we feel often gets overlooked is sort of the link between human trafficking and the death penalty in terms of the work that we do in Pakistan. This is specifically in narcotics cases. A little background on human trafficking is that Pakistan has passed a law that sort of deals with human trafficking, and it is very much in line with the international law on it. The international law is specifically the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, long name. And one of the things about the definition in the protocol is very much in line with the definition Pakistan also has for human trafficking. The definition can by and large be sort of categorized in 3 different ways. One is the act. So the actual act of the human trafficking would be recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. The means would be the use of threat or force or coercion, abduction or fraud, deception, sort of abuse of power, or of sort of abusing somebody's vulnerability to sort of control them and to force their consent. And that would be for specifically for the purpose, which is the third aspect, for the purpose of exploitation. Now, one of the other aspects on how this sort of interjects with narcotics cases is the fact that the law in Pakistan specifically has a provision that states that victims cannot be held criminally liable for the offenses they commit as victims of human trafficking. Now, this is an angle we've been sort of pursuing in a few cases, 2 of which I have sort of highlighted here. One is sort of a young man who was sort of arrested on charges of smuggling heroin. He is a British national of Pakistani origin. And another is a couple in which sort of the woman is considered, and her family have told her that they have concerns about her vulnerability and that she may have been coerced. Now, the reason all of this is also a problem is that in these 2 cases and in several other cases that we've worked on, there was no investigation or consideration by law enforcement that they might be victims of human trafficking, even though they did in fact have all sort of the very sort of the trademarks of being considered as being so. So one of the sort of demographics of those arrested for drug trafficking offenses is the fact that they are generally sort of people who are vulnerable to human trafficking, are that they come from poverty, they have a lack of education and illiteracy, and generally the average value of narcotics seized was 1,600 times the median income of the person. Human trafficking generally is a huge problem in Pakistan. The US State Department's 2020 Trafficking in Persons report placed Pakistan on the tier 2 watch list as well. And all in all, we are trying to sort of, because they are not given the benefit of being considered victims of human trafficking, they are hence sort of might actually be sentenced to death, which is not good, and they're not being given the due process that they should. Now, I realize everything I have just talked about earlier are also mitigating factors, but sort of this is to highlight other mitigating factors that can be considered. It is, however, also very common practice for defense lawyers not to investigate, sort of investigate or raise mitigation during the trial. There are several reasons for this, but a lot of times in death penalty cases, because of the prisoner coming not from sort of very not being able to afford a private lawyer, they generally get state lawyers, and many state lawyers sort of aren't very well paid, and they don't meet their clients before the trial and generally do not give the appropriate level of care to their clients. So other mitigating factors that you can raise sort of at the time of the trial is sort of lesser participation, sort of that the prisoner did not have as large a role in the offense as stated, or that they should that means that they should not be given the death penalty. Lack of premeditation, that this was something that they had not planned to do. Provocation, again, similar to lack of premeditation, that they were provoked or was out of anger. Life history prior to the arrest is also something that many lawyers don't bring up. So this includes sort of social and familial circumstances, sort of things related to the economic, social, or cultural or marginalization from the community, mental illness or intellectual disability, and of course, then also considering sort of physical disability. Now, mind you that even though some things are not brought up during the trial, it is very possible to also bring up further mitigating factors at the time of the appeal. So things such as like the conduct in prison. Was the prisoner well behaved? Did they pursue further education while in prison? What was their conduct like with the other guards and prisoners? That kind of thing. Time spent on death row. The average death row prisoner spends about 11 years on death row. They spend about 10 years on death row until the case reaches the Supreme Court. So this is something that should definitely be brought up at the time of appeal. We have seen cases in which they've spent over 20 plus years on death rows in prison as well. And then sort of also considering the fact if other people who were involved in the case were acquitted or not. So all of these factors are also come from the 310 cases I discussed earlier from the Supreme Court's jurisprudence. And to that effect, we made an online manual to help criminal defense lawyers in Pakistan to be able to provide effective representation and to be able to apply the Supreme Court's jurisprudence to sort of help their clients from being sentenced to death. And the link is on the screen if you'd like to sort of have a look at that. Thank you so much.
Right. Okay. Thank you again, Andy. That was really, really good. And we've got lots of good questions that have come in. So I'll go in a rough time order for it. Keith has asked, obviously, I said it's obviously very important work. What about your funding stream at Reprieve? Is that purely through donation?
It's through sort of donations and grants.
Okay, is that grants from, obviously it's non-governmental, so where are those grants from?
Sort of government, other organizations, that kind of thing.
Right, okay, and that's an international thing, obviously.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, okay. Paul asks, do you work exclusively in Pakistan? I mean, we know it's sort of South East Asia as well as a greater region, but I guess what about Reprieve in other countries that have the death penalty, like the US, Zimbabwe, Iraq?
We work in lots of different countries. Sort of, I think all of the countries that have the death penalty, and we have regional teams as well. So I'm part of the South Asia team. Then we also have the Southeast Asia team, the Middle East and North Africa team. Then we have the Africa team and the US team as well. And then we also have sort of work on other projects. So sort of, like I mentioned, the Stop Lethal Injection project. We have we also work on Guantanamo Bay and that kind of thing. We also work on sort of drone strikes and have an entire project for that as well. So we have lots of different projects as well. Death penalty is a large project that we do work on.
Sure, yeah. And I imagine pretty complex in different countries in how it's sort of approached. Martin being Martin has asked two questions to make it difficult for me to read out. Thank you, Martin. He asked, you said that torture by law enforcement is not illegal, and the only weapon as such that you have is going to court as a private person. Can you ever be successful with this if you assume that police will stick together in that situation?
Okay, so just to clarify on this question is the fact that torture is in fact illegal. It's not criminalized. So if law there's no specific criminal offense where a police using torture is in fact sort of an actual offense in itself. You do have sort of other criminal offenses that you can use. So sort of the normal offenses for hurting someone are the ones that are generally used. And the other thing is that you can pursue litigation as an option, and that's by and large mostly what you can only do. And yes, the police do stick, of course, like, you know, same fraternity and all of that, and they sort of stick together when it comes to these sorts of things, even though sort of from my previous experience is that it's generally given to other police officers who also sort of, because they're friends or know them, and just because of the nature of their jobs. So yes.
Okay. Is there any sign of that? Is that changing? I mean, is there elements of, I don't want to use the word corruption, but pressure within the police that?
Oh yes, definitely. I think you have what is called the transparency index, which sort of measures corruption, and Pakistan is definitely very high on the very low on the list for that, in terms of sort of level of corruption within the country. And that's something that's also very common and well known in Pakistan as well. So yeah.
Yeah. And common, I think, in lots of other parts of the world as well, unfortunately. Martin, also, I'll say, what are super prisons?
Oh, I think he means secret prisons. And secret prisons are sort of, you know, prisons that things like Guantanamo Bay, that kind of thing.
Okay. What are the large? I mean, Guantanamo is the obvious one that sort of everyone thinks of. What are the others that people should be aware of?
Honestly, apart from that, I know of one other, which was Bagram prison, which was in Afghanistan, which was on an air base as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. All right. Eileen has messaged. She wonders, are you working with any UK citizens or their wider cases? I think perhaps in UK citizens, perhaps in Pakistan. Or?
Yes. All of the cases I mentioned, excluding the veteran, were all British nationals.
Okay, right. Jess, I think we've answered your first question, Jess, about funding. Your other question, as an organisation as Reprieve, are you ever under pressure or threats of safety as workers of Reprieve when you're on the ground in those countries?
I don't think so. No, we generally wouldn't pursue anything that would lead to us sort of having safety concerns. And we don't at the moment with any of the work that we do in any country.
Okay. Martin again. Martin. What is the attitude amongst lawyers towards the death penalty? And he also says, "Well done for the manual for the capital defence lawyers." But yeah, what's their attitude towards death penalty?
Thank you. Generally, the thing about lawyers is that it really depends on sort of, well, the type of lawyer that they are. A lot of them are for it, a lot of them are against it. I think generally people, sort of more specifically lawyers who are in fact dealing with criminal cases, are generally kind of against it, mostly because one of the problems with the death penalty in general is the image of the death penalty as well. So people who aren't directly involved in it don't actually realize how horrible it is, if that makes sense. So it's sort of this image of somebody who's sort of a very hardened criminal, compared to somebody who's actually just sort of has had really terrible luck, which has ended with them being on death row. It's sort of balancing that. And of course, lawyers who are in fact involved in all of this do actually realize that this isn't correct. Also, something I didn't mention while in the discussion today was the actual prison conditions of somebody who's in fact on death row. So you're in actually a very small cell. You are in the cell for 22 hours or 23 hours of the day. It's generally with one other person. Sometimes they're overcrowded as well. So it's sort of the length of slightly longer. I think it's 8 feet long and a few feet wide kind of thing for two people. And it sort of has a tap and other very basic amenities. All your food is given to you. If you have visitors, they have to meet you in your cell, and sort of lots of other things. So yeah,
that's a very big mental impact, I would imagine, on prisoners in that situation.
Yes, that's also why being on death row for so long is so problematic, because you're also not with general population. Even in sort of the 1 or 2 hours, depending on which prison you are, of sort of the outside time you have, it's also within the barracks, so it's not with the general population either.
Yeah, sure. Okay. One question I was going to ask sort of follows on from that. Obviously, there's the manual that's been produced. Is there any sort of direct action from the Pakistani state to assist with legal aid and defence to improve that, or is it all outward pressure to try and reform that? Are they sort of doing anything themselves internally to help?
With legal aid?
Yeah, for things like legal aid, or trying to improve that process to make it, at least the appearance of being more transparent and more accessible to people.
So the thing about legal aid is the fact if I can be very honest with you, it's very dependent on province to province on sort of how they manage that. And this comes from my experience of being a litigator in Pakistan, was generally that you would, in trial courts, you generally have sort of a list of people who've applied for it. And then the court sort of chooses who gets selected. You as a prisoner don't really have a choice. In terms of accountability of them, it's very low. It's non-existent from what I've seen. And you do have provisions for improving legal aid as well. And this is something that's sort of come up in Parliament as well. But I honestly don't have enough information on what came of that.
Okay. Martin would like to know what you mentioned. Pakistan are now on the tier 2 watch list for human trafficking. What are the sort of tiers, and who's on tier 1? Presumably there's a tier 1 and.
So basically, I'm sorry, this is a very long, complicated question. You have different sort of levels of, they've sort of rated different countries depending on how bad or how much that country has dealt with human trafficking in said countries. And this is by the US State Department. So this is not sort of by an international organization or anything. And they sort of consider factors. They consider lots of factors and have a very extensive report. And sort of tier 2, and sort of, I think being on the watch list is considered is considered a country in which things seem to be getting worse. And I think the higher you are on the list, the worse it is. So if your tier 1 is the worst, tier 2 is pretty bad. It's that kind of sort of classification.
Yeah. Do you know what countries are under tier 1 at the moment?
I'm sorry, I don't.
No, okay, no. I'm pretty sure we can find out, but just be curious to know who the sort of worst of the worst are, and Yeah. You mentioned the moratorium on the death penalty that was enforced till recently. Do you think there'll be another one?
It's difficult to say. Also, given the fact that we now live in a world where COVID exists, it's quite difficult to sort of say sort of how they're going to manage sort of people on death row, executions, that kind of thing. In terms of a moratorium, I don't really think so. We are hoping and are working towards there being some form of moratorium on the death penalty as well. So, yeah.
Hopefully. Fingers crossed. Just going back to the grants and the funding question. Jess asks, do you actually have to apply for those? Is there a process you have to go through for that? Do you know?
If I can be very honest, that's not my department.
Not your
I don't
area.
know very well about that kind of bit of the organization.
That is fair. That is fair enough. Yeah. What about does the organisation work at all in China? I know it's very difficult territory to work in, but
no, we don't work in China. China is very secretive about its death row, so I think it's considered a state secret. Their sort of executions and death row population, so there's no information on that.
No. Okay. How did you yourself become involved in the first place? And is your background from law or human rights more generally?
Oh, so Reprieve is the fourth organization I'm now working at. I worked as a criminal litigator, so I was a defense lawyer in Pakistan. I worked at a law firm as sort of what you would consider a barrister here, sort of going to court and sort of defending people in their trial and appeals. I did that for about 2.5 years. I then worked for an anti-death penalty organization in Pakistan, and then I worked for the Legal Aid Society, where I was working on police training, and I worked on sexual and gender-based violence cases. And then I joined Reprieve.
Okay. You've built up a lot of history there, I think, and built up a lot of knowledge. Yeah. What about prisoners who are acquitted or perhaps escaped from sort of the clutches of death row? Do they have access to follow-up care to reacclimatise, or they're just thrown out?
They're just thrown out. If I could be very honest, there's no sort of rehabilitation or sort of anything to integrate them back into society. You do have trainings and jobs and education inside prison. A lot of that is also curtailed for people who are on death row, given sort of a lot of people who were on death rows and their sentences were converted. A lot of times when they come out of being on death row, they're in general population, which I suppose slightly helps, but there is none, and this is something that is very concerning.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I think the commonly accepted thing that people need help when they've been in scenarios like that, and it's for the greater good overall. But there was a question I was going to go back to, and it escapes me. Now. Just a sort of final one from me. What sort of progress and time frame have you seen? Have you seen a great deal of progress, say in the last 5 years, for example, or is it just very, very slow and steady work?
Are you talking about the death penalty in Pakistan or our work in Pakistan?
Well, your work more generally in Pakistan, sorry, yeah.
Okay. So our work generally sort of has been focused very much because of the Supreme Court's sort of the case law that the Supreme Court developed, the 310 cases, reported cases, which sort of in which so many people were acquitted. So sort of our work on that has significantly progressed, and it has very much amplified sort of the actual application of the death penalty. So uh, in, it is actually quite ironic, but the image of the death penalty in Pakistan was much more severe before all of this. So I think it was in 2017, I think it was, where it was presumed that more than 7,000 people were on death row in Pakistan. And it was only later on, because of another case in the Supreme Court, where jail officials had to file a report to the federal ombudsman, who then had to give it to the Supreme Court. And a byproduct of that was the fact that they found out how many people were actually on death row, which was about 4,000 plus. But in terms of sort of our work on all of this, is the fact that we're sort of very much working on slowly having people having a better understanding of who is on death row, and also to have a lot of the case law that the Supreme Court has given being implemented into the system, and that it's sort of followed by a trial court, which then sort of gives it more power and sort of strengthens it.
Okay. Well, final question, unless anybody else submits anything just on the subject of blasphemy from Martin. Don't worry, Martin, I've got your question. It's all right. Calm down. He says apparently many people in Pakistan are against the blasphemy laws, but how many people are actually against the death penalty? Is there any data on that?
Unfortunately, there's no data on that. This is also something that's quite difficult to sort of ascertain. Generally, people are for the death penalty, and that again has a lot to do with this misconception of what the death penalty actually looks like, and sort of who is in fact on death row. So yes, so as a result, you have a lot of misunderstanding of Pakistan's death row. This is something that people and we are also trying to change, but it hasn't reached the point where it's gotten better. It also, people's opinion on the death penalty very much differs depending on sort of their economic or social status, or sort of their own personal beliefs, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Blasphemy carries a mandatory death penalty, but there haven't been any executions because of blasphemy. So does that mean nobody is committing blasphemy?
This is slightly confusing, but I understand what you mean.
It's Martin again. Oh, that was Ushi, right? That's even more confusing.
So, okay, it's one of the things you need to understand. The whole law on blasphemy and it having the death penalty and this mandatory death penalty is all very, very complicated. So I'm just going to sort of very much break it down for you. Basically, the thing is that people do get convicted and then they get acquitted of blasphemy. And blasphemy is very much used as a tool of oppression against other people. And that is something that then gets highlighted at appeal, which is why they are then acquitted. A very good example of this was the Asia Bibi case. I don't know if you guys remember that, but that was a huge case in which the Supreme Court acquitted this woman of blasphemy, and it led to sort of nationwide protests against sort of her acquittal. However, a lot of the people who protested were in fact also sort of criminalized for the crimes they committed while protesting, and which also furthered sort of this debate on blasphemy as well, and why we still have it. Blasphemy, you also need to remember, has a lot of historic context in the region, in terms of the fact that it is actually in our statutes books, because at the time it was actually brought in by the British when it was part of when India was a British colony. So it was something that was brought in onto the statute books as a result of that. And it's just something that's remained there. And it's just sort of morphed into this thing. A lot of times actually sort of holding somebody accountable for blasphemy in a purely sort of procedural aspect is actually quite difficult to do. And Amnesty International has done a really good report on this. I remember reading it a while ago now, I might add, in which they actually discussed on how a lot of judges and lawyers are very deathly afraid of sort of taking up blasphemy cases, to the point where a lot of judges just convict just so that they don't get targeted.
Right.
And lawyers are
Right.
very hesitant to take on cases as well.
Okay, yeah. Do people ultimately end up coming to harm or much worse when they're in prison for a blasphemy conviction?
They're kept separately as a result, from what I've been told.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Changing tack slightly, Paul has asked, are there any political parties within Pakistan that are more progressive on issues like blasphemy, gay rights, death penalty, those kind of things?
That is also a bit of a difficult question to answer. So there is the Pakistan People's Party, which is Benazir Bhutto's party, which her father started. They are against the death penalty, and that is something that they have mandated. It was during their rule that you had the moratorium. They're the ones who instated the moratorium. They're the ones who sort of ratified the ICCPR and the other conventions I was talking about, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and everything. It was during their government's time that all of that was ratified. But in terms of sort of other things, in terms of LGBTQ and sort of other progressive sort of laws and policies, is that it generally really depends on either the politician or the temperature at the time, if I can be very honest. So even with the death penalty right now, with the current ruling party, which is Imran Khan's party, the PTI, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf is the entire name of the party. Even with them, like Imran Khan has from time to time said some things which have been very, very concerning regarding the death penalty. I think at one point he said some about public executions he sort of supported, but then on the other hand, nothing's really come of it either. So it's sort of, and this came in light of sort of in South Asia generally at the sort of a few months ago, and well, last year now, sort of rape became a huge problem in the region generally, and there was a lot of talk about sort of rape and sort of how it should be punished with the death penalty. And you can see that with even in India's statistics, and with, so Bangladesh recently also changed its law to have the death penalty for rape, and even in India you can now see that with their death penalty numbers, is that you're more likely to get sentenced to death if you've committed, if you've been charged with an offense of rape. So even with that, even in Pakistan at the time, you've had a lot of that with rape, but just generally because of just the public outcry in the region, because it's sort of this sort of helpless women who were sort of everything regarding that. So yes. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Okay, we've come to the end of the formal questions. Nobody else has messaged, so I think it's probably time to say, Andy, thank you very much for the talk. Thank you very much for the Q&As. It was really, really good. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone.